Hatteras, North Carolina, a small seaside town where the salty winds and silver waves have gnawed at every board of the pier for decades. People here are used to whispered tales, to young lovers passing through and vanishing into the horizon, to storms that erase all traces from the sand overnight. But there's one story that still makes this town fall silent whenever someone brings it up. On a summer night in 1992, a young married couple pushed off from the Hatteras dock in a small boat and never came back. The case was closed quickly. People called it an accident. But in August 2024, something was dredged up from the bottom of the harbor that forced everyone to look again. And this time, no one was so sure the ocean had swallowed them whole. Because what that old photograph revealed was enough to make the whole town shiver. That evening, July 11, 1992, the skies over Hatteras were unusually beautiful. The breeze was mild, the sea calm, the surface shimmering gold as the sun began to sink. At the weathered old pier, a few tourists were still returning boats, lugging fishing rods, snapping last-minute photos before dusk. And there, among them, Erik and Emily Larson appeared. He was 31, a carpenter from Raleigh, broad-shouldered, sun-kissed, carrying a cooler in one hand, his dark hair neat under a faded Red Sox cap. She was 27, an elementary school teacher, wearing a simple white tank top, her silver wedding band still gleaming as if brand new. They looked like the happiest newlyweds alive, eyes laughing, steps light as air. People would later say they'd rented a small seaside cabin, painted pale blue on Old Lighthouse Road, number 14, to spend their honeymoon. Police records say they rented their boat at 5:37 p.m. A simple aluminum skiff, oars resting in place, 2 life jackets, a folded blanket. Erik signed the slip in his own hand. Larson. The last person to see them leave that night was Bill Tobin, the 52-year-old dock attendant. 3 decades later, he still remembered it clearly. "They just kept laughing," he said for the record, his voice still faintly shaky, like nothing in the world could touch them. But Bill remembered one more thing, something he told police at the time, and something they brushed off as a fisherman's superstition. He remembered 2 strange men standing at the end of the dock, just a few feet away, both dressed in dark jackets, not smiling, not speaking, not blinking, just standing there, staring silently as the young couple's boat glided into the fog. "I didn't know who they were," Bill said, "but their eyes, they froze my blood." 3 days later, Erik and Emily's boat drifted back north toward Gull Rock. On board was a single life jacket, still tucked under the seat. No signs of a struggle. No blood, no bodies. 1 oar was missing. The cooler was empty. Police closed the case, called it an accident, said the Outer Banks currents had claimed them. People shook their heads, mourned them at All Saints Church in Raleigh, and slowly, as all sad stories do, theirs faded. The posters peeled off utility poles, the wind swept away their footprints in the sand, and the town stopped speaking their names. 32 years later, when that rusted box was hauled up, Detective Caroline Marks stood in the sterile glow of the county lab, staring at the last photo from that roll of film. Erik was smiling wide, oar in one hand, his arm wrapped around Emily's waist as she leaned into him, happy and alive. But behind them, the cold eyes of a third man, and a bony hand resting lightly on Emily's shoulder, as if it had always belonged there. In the silence of the evidence room, under that faint humming fluorescent light, Caroline took her pen and drew a black line through the old case file's final line. Presumed, drowned, closed. And she wrote, in neat block letters, "Case reopened." Out on the pier, the waves still lapped softly. The air still smelled of salt and diesel, just like that night. But this time, Caroline swore, the secret wouldn't stay buried. The Larson case file wasn't even an inch thick. A few yellowed sheets clipped together, a rental receipt, a handful of short statements, 2 black and white photos of a drifting skiff. Caroline Marks laid it flat on her desk, staring at it in silence. She didn't believe in ghosts. But that photo, the bony hand, The unfamiliar face, the unblinking eyes, sent a chill all the way down her spine. She knew now, without a doubt, this wasn't an accident. First, Caroline went back to the original boat rental log at Hatteras Marina. The dock was now managed by Phil Tobin, nephew of Bill Tobin from all those years ago. Phil led her behind the counter, unlocking a dented steel cabinet. Inside was an old ledger wrapped in brittle newspaper, the cover marked Boat Rentals 1991-1993. She flipped to July 11th. There it was, Boat 12 E. Larson, 5:37 p.m. Serial NCX47. The return column was blank, marked only with a red circle and a question mark. She turned to the next day and frowned. A shaky entry in different handwriting. Boat 12, returned, 6:12 p.m. MT, needed rinse, extra jacket on board. MT? Caroline asked. Phil shrugged. That ain't my uncle's handwriting. He always wrote in neat block letters. This is cursive, sloppy. Caroline snapped a photo of the page and drove back to her office. On her evidence board, she wrote MT in red marker beside the blown-up photo of the bony hand on Emily's shoulder. 3 hours later, the marina's 1992 seasonal employee records appeared on her computer screen. And at the very bottom of the list was a name. Matthew Tenko, seasonal hire, cash, no W-2. No permanent address. Note, lived in trailer behind Finch Hollow. Then, vanished. 6 months after the Larsons disappeared. No trace. Caroline tapped her pen against the desk, staring at the photo of the hand. The bitten nails, the raised veins. The way it rested on Emily's shoulder wasn't hesitant. It was casual, like it belonged there. That night, Caroline stayed late. The lights off, the glow of her monitor the only thing in the room. She scoured the old case file, the boat recovery report, the witness statements. And on the very last page, she found a line no one had touched in 32 years. Witness reports, 2 men standing on dock. No names, no follow-up. Dismissed. She circled 2 men beneath the photo of the hand and the faint silhouette behind Emily. Then she widened her search. It wasn't long before a personnel file turned up from the Southampton Correctional Facility in Virginia. William Rhodes, terminated May 1992. Boundary issues with juvenile detainees. Advised not to rehire. Rhodes, Tenko. 1 man vanished. 1 man disgraced. And 2 dark figures standing silent on the dock that night, watching the Larsons' boat fade into the fog. Caroline wrote both names in bold on her whiteboard, connecting them with red string to the photograph of Erik and Emily. She stepped back to look at the board. 32 years ago, the victims disappeared without a trace, but Rhodes and Tenko were still out there, watching. Outside her window, the ocean wind whistled faintly through the shutters, carrying a salty chill into the room. Caroline felt it in her bones. This game was only just beginning. Caroline barely slept for the next 2 nights. She kept the blown-up photo of that bony hand and shadowed face on her kitchen table, staring at it every time she walked by. The longer she looked, the more certain she became. Those eyes were looking straight into the lens, cold, confident, as if he knew this photo would live to expose him decades later. She needed more, something solid enough to put Rhodes and Tenko on the record as suspects. Rhodes' personnel file showed he'd worked as a warden at Southampton Correctional Facility in Virginia, but had left just months before the Larsons disappeared. No forwarding address, just a cryptic note, boundary issues, advised not to rehire. An old colleague she tracked down in Virginia still remembered. Rhodes had once bragged about having a place in Carolina. Quiet. Remote. Caroline spread a Dare County map across her desk. She combed through remote parcels for hours before circling a set of coordinates on the edge of Pisgah National Forest, about 40 miles out of town. County land records showed a cabin there, owned by a shadowy LLC formed in 1987 and dissolved in 1994. A maintenance ticket from 1991 noted, plumbing repair. Generator service, signed M. Tenko. His name, right there. The next morning, Caroline zipped up her jacket, grabbed her flashlight, and drove the winding dirt road into Pisgah. Her tires skidded on gravel as she climbed the final hill. And then it appeared, the cabin. Weathered, gray, its windows patched with duct tape, moss creeping over the sagging porch. Ivy choked the steps. The air was damp and heavy, smelling of rot. The door wasn't locked. It groaned as she pushed it open. Inside was empty. Just an old folding chair and a wooden crate nailed shut. A dead security camera hung crooked in the corner, its wire stapled neatly to the wall. To the left was a colder room. On the floor lay a ripped mattress, a filthy pink blanket, and a child's rabbit-shaped nightlight. Caroline crouched, running her hand along the wall. Beneath the faded wallpaper were tally marks, hundreds of them, carved deep. Days, months, years. She swallowed hard and stepped back into the hallway. In a narrow closet near the door, she found a box sealed with silver duct tape, heavy. She dragged it out, set it on the chair, and sliced it open with her knife. Inside were stacks of VHS tapes, each carefully labeled PR Erie 11, PR is 12, PR is 13, and a thick folder of files. She opened one. Subject, PW date, July 11, 1992. Intake, 6:47 p.m. Response, compliant. Second session scheduled, July 14th. Cancelled, contamination risk. Recording, archived. PRHL Hatteras. Emily. Below that were more folders, AM. LSCG. Names she didn't recognize. She felt the back of her neck go cold. How many victims had passed through this room? How many never made it home? She set the folder aside and pulled out another bin. Hundreds more VHS tapes, all numbered, all neatly arranged. As if revered. Caroline left the cabin with PR Circa 11 and PR Couture 12 secured in evidence bags. Out on the porch, the wind hissed through the pines like a faint, mournful whisper. She looked up, feeling for the first time that the entire forest was watching her. Now she knew. Rhodes and Tenko weren't just two ghosts on the dock. They were gatekeepers, keyholders. And this was only the first door in a much darker maze she was about to enter. The press caught wind of the case the very next morning after Caroline found the cabin. A few local papers ran brief headlines. 1992 missing persons case reopened. New evidence unearthed in Pisgah Woods. Crowds of onlookers started gathering around the Hatteras dock, whispering and pointing. Some shook their heads and muttered, "Knew it wasn't no accident." Others said nothing, as if the news had stirred some old fear deep in the town. Caroline, meanwhile, stayed at her desk, her eyes fixed on the tapes. The lab was still digitizing them, but just seeing PR Circa 11 written on the label made her stomach knot. Every time she pictured the torn mattress, the rabbit nightlight, those tally marks cut into the wall, her insides clenched. That night, just as she finished a briefing with the sheriff's media team, the duty phone rang. A woman's voice came on the line, low, raspy, halting. I need to see the one who found the tapes. My name is Emily Larson." Caroline froze. She blinked, thinking she'd misheard. "About? What did you say? Emily Larson? I'm at the Hatteras dock. I'll wait." Caroline sped through the empty streets, her heart hammering. The night air whistled through her cracked window, sharp and salty. When she pulled into the dock, she saw a lone figure standing at the end of the wooden pier, back turned, wearing a dark brown windbreaker, hair tied up. Caroline stepped closer, her pulse pounding in her ears. The woman turned when she heard the boards creak under Caroline's boots. In that instant, Caroline's breath caught. She'd seen those eyes before. They were unmistakable. Emily Larson, you see now those eyes were deeper, cloudier, changed by 3 decades of silence. Emily stared back at her. "I saw what you released," she said softly, her voice trembling. Caroline could only whisper, You're alive." Emily gave a faint, weary smile. "No, but I didn't die." Caroline didn't know where to start. The questions knotted in her throat, but Emily quietly pulled a large, weathered envelope from her jacket. Those men. It wasn't just the two of them. There are more. More places, more people than you think. This is what I've gathered. They call it the Fellowship. And the Overseer, she swallowed, is still alive. Caroline took the envelope. Inside were photographs, notes, names, locations. Children, rooms, other tapes, all marked in the same familiar handwriting as the labels on the Pisgah cabin tapes. Her stomach sank. Her chest tightened. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Caroline asked, her voice hoarse. Emily lowered her eyes, her voice almost a whisper lost in the breeze. "I didn't know who I could trust. They're everywhere. Police, courts, foster care. Rhodes used to call it the door inside the door. You think you've escaped, but there's always another door waiting." Caroline stepped closer, laying a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. "You're safe now. I promise." Emily gave a sad little smile, something fragile and proud, still alive behind it. "No one's ever really safe. But at least, now we're not alone." She turned, walking slowly down the creaking boards, into the dark. The waves slapped softly below, the wind rattled the pilings, and Caroline stood there, gripping the envelope tight. In her head, Emily's last words echoed, "The Overseer is still alive." Within 48 hours of receiving the envelope Emily had handed her, Caroline called an emergency meeting with federal agents. By dawn, 3 black FBI SUVs rolled into the Dare County Sheriff's lot. Stern faces stepped out, steel cases in hand, their eyes betraying no surprise. Caroline sat at the head of the table, spreading out each photograph Emily had collected. Dimly lit rooms, children clutching blankets, ledgers with names and wire transfers crisscrossing state lines. All of it bore the cold, clinical stamp of something organized, deliberate. The Fellowship. One of the agents, a woman who introduced herself only as Kravitz, glanced over the files and simply nodded. "We've known this network existed. We called it the Family Sanctum. But we've never had a survivor come back, let alone internal documentation." Kravitz explained they suspected this was a trafficking ring that had operated in the shadows for over 3 decades, stretching from the Carolinas up through Pennsylvania, into New Hampshire and Vermont. A web of safe houses, indoctrination camps, and pink-walled rooms like the one in Pisgah, all hidden behind the veneer of independent churches and local charities. Caroline just sat there, her hands balling into fists as she stared at Emily's photos. A blonde girl holding a chalkboard with her name and date. A boy, no older than 10, standing in a concrete room, his eyes empty. All of them catalogued like experiments. "Where do we start?" Caroline finally asked. Kravitz didn't even look up. "We start where Emily marked. New Hampshire, Pennsylvania. Then we clean out the rest. The slower we move, the more they move their people." That afternoon, Caroline joined the task force on a raid outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. A 2-story house with a blacked-out steeple buried deep in the woods. Emily's documents had referred to it as Hold Point 3. The convoy stopped half a mile out. Agents fanned into the undergrowth, quiet as ghosts. Caroline followed close behind Kravitz, gun drawn, her heart hammering. The door came down with a single kick. Inside was a rank smell of bleach, damp, and something else, sour and faint, that made the room fall silent. In a large downstairs room, Caroline saw 3 children. A boy around 19 and 2 girls, 10 and 12. Pale, thin, but alive. They looked up as the flashlights hit them, arms wrapped around each other, not screaming. When Caroline crouched and showed them a photo of Emily, the older girl whispered, "She said she'd come back." "She came back." Caroline's throat tightened. She squeezed the girl's hand gently and nodded. "She came back, and we're getting you out of here." The next day, FBI teams raided 2 more sites in New Hampshire and Vermont. At each, they found more VHS tapes, labeled the same way as Pisgah, PR Hatteras 88, PR Hatteras 89, PR Hatteras 90. The same pink rooms, the same tally marks, the same rabbit-shaped nightlights, over and over, like a sick ritual replicated across state lines. Caroline returned to Dare County well past midnight. She sat alone in her office, staring at the evidence board. She pinned up the new photos from the FBI raids and traced the red string connecting Rhodes, Tenko, the Fellowship, and at the center, a black circle labeled the Overseer, at large. Even though they'd dismantled the network in 3 states, his shadow still loomed. He was still out there. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and heard Emily's voice from that night on the dock. The Overseer is still alive, and she told herself, and I won't stop. 3 days after the raids, as news of the dismantled trafficking network dominated headlines, Caroline began to feel it, that quiet, watchful presence. At first it was just a silver sedan parked outside the sheriff's lot each night as she left. Always on time, always in the same spot. The engine would hum to life as she stepped out, and it would glide away without a sound. Then it was a man, always across the street, leaning against a lamppost, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on her. He never smoked, never checked his phone. He simply watched. She tried to ignore it, but by the 3rd night, she knew. He wasn't going away. Security cameras caught nothing useful. No plates, no DMV match. No name in any system. It was as if he didn't exist. That night, Caroline stayed late in the archive room, cross-checking the PR tape logs. Past 2 a.m., she heard it. The soft, deliberate sound of a door closing at the far end of the aisle. She drew her sidearm, heart pounding, and moved down the dark corridor, her shadow flickering in the pale fluorescent light. There he was, the man, standing at the PR shelf, holding an unsealed tape in his hand. When the beam of her flashlight cut through the dimness, he turned, calm and unflinching. Caroline fired a warning shot into the floor. Dust rose in a thin cloud. Slowly, he knelt, placed his hands behind his head. She closed the distance, cuffed him, and called it in. He didn't resist. By morning they had a name, Matthew Tenko, alive, arrested, sitting in Dare County Sheriff's custody after 32 years of silence. He sat in the interrogation room, upright, hollow-eyed, his expression unsettlingly serene. His answers were clipped, almost mechanical. Rhodes was dead, he confirmed. Long dead. But Tenko insisted he himself had never disappeared, only watched. And that what they'd uncovered so far was nothing but the surface. Deeper layers still waited. Caroline left the room, letting the words settle, letting his empty stare fade from her mind. But they lingered anyway. That night, alone in the evidence room, she played PR Seawork 13 again. When Emily's eyes on the tape locked on the camera, Caroline felt something tighten in her chest. She could almost hear Emily's voice beneath the grainy static. This isn't over. And Caroline swore to herself then. She would see it through. Wherever the Overseer was hiding, his shadow wouldn't escape her. Not for long. News of Matthew Tenko's arrest spread quickly, but the public only learned what the FBI allowed them to know. Most outlets ran a few dry lines. A suspect connected to a decades-old human trafficking ring was apprehended in Dare County, North Carolina, after more than 30 years on the run. No mention of Emily. No mention of the Overseer. In his holding cell, Tenko remained the same cold, silent figure. He didn't resist, didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't offer more than fragmented hints. But he didn't need to say much. His silence spoke louder than anything else. Caroline knew the network hadn't truly collapsed. She felt it in the loose threads Emily's files still held. Torn photographs, names that didn't match any official missing persons records, faces that appeared on the tapes but seemed to belong to children no one had ever looked for. And always, looming in the background, was the Overseer, still unseen, still pulling strings. She shifted the hunt to a new angle. She ordered a full review of every asset the FBI had ever seized in connection to the network, cross-checking them with the breadcrumbs Emily had left, For nights on end, she stood before her board, piecing together tiny details: utility bills, parking slips, a cabin reservation slip from Vermont's Green Mountains, even scraps of notes fished out of the Pisgah cabin. Then an old file surfaced from deep in the FBI archives, stamped confidential. A dark blue Suburban with pre-1995 plates, abandoned at a remote farm in Vermont after a welfare check. According to the report, police had found a man dead of an overdose in the main house. Younger, unidentified, not matching Rhodes or Tenko. But in the adjacent barn, they discovered a locked freezer filled with dozens of VHS tapes, labeled PR. Rior 188 PR, Rior 200, along with a loose notebook titled Family Sanctum Fellowship, Northeast Cell. The file had never been released. The FBI had quietly shelved it. Caroline sat alone, reading every line, her fingers gripping the paper so tightly the edges curled under her nails. He was still out there. The network still had branches no one had cleared. That night, she stood at the edge of Hatteras dock, staring down at the waves lapping quietly below. The sea air was sharp and salty, smelling of kelp and old oil. Behind her, the whole town slept. But somewhere out there, the shadow of the overseer was still alive, waiting, patient. Caroline murmured into the wind, almost a promise. "I'll find you, even if I have to burn your whole maze to the ground." Then she turned and walked back up the dock, her steps steady, ready to keep hunting. The longer the hunt for the overseer dragged on, the more Caroline felt haunted by what was missing. The photographs, the PR tapes, the files Emily had left, all of it felt like just the surface. She knew something more was out there, something that would lay bare the full scope of what had happened that night, the night Erik and Emily Larson vanished. The breakthrough came late one afternoon when the Dare County Archives submitted a routine inventory report. One cardboard box stood out, unnumbered, unmarked, sealed with a strip of tape scrawled in black ink. Watch. It had sat in storage since the 90s, never opened. Inside was a single VHS cassette, unlabeled black plastic case, coated in dust. Caroline carried it into the evidence viewing room, slid it into the old player, took a deep breath, and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, static at first, then an image. Time-stamped July 11th, 1992, 6:32 p.m. The camera shook slightly, aimed at the floor of the boat, a cooler, Emily's sandal. Then it tilted up. Erik smiled, an oar resting across his knees, Emily leaning on his shoulder, her hair blowing in the ocean wind, her smile radiant. Caroline felt her stomach knot, because of the angle. The camera wasn't in their hands. It was across from them, low, angled upward, secretly watching. The footage glitched briefly, then cut. The boat drifted, empty now. Just the water lapping and the faint creak of wood. 30 seconds of silence before a man's voice murmured, low, rasping. "Ready?" A second voice, younger, nervous, answered. "She's still warm." The camera jolted, now showing bare legs, wet jeans clinging to skin, a pale hand gripping the gunwale. A dark tangle of hair fell into frame. Emily, motionless, lips pale, her shirt torn. The screen glitched again, then went black. Caroline sat there, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles ached. The tape said everything. This wasn't a disappearance. This was a hunt. Planned, filmed, kept as a trophy. She carefully slipped the tape into an evidence bag, sealed it, and scrawled across the tag, PR, Master. That night, back in her office, she looked up at the photograph of Emily staring into the camera, pinned to her board. Those eyes weren't pleading. They weren't defeated. They were strong, as if daring someone to see her, even decades too late. Caroline stared back and gave a faint nod. Now she had seen. 2 weeks after Caroline discovered the second tape, a heavy brown envelope with no return address was left in the sheriff's department mail slot at dawn. The postmark traced it to a self-service kiosk 3 towns over. Inside was a single VHS cassette, black, pristine, dust-free. On the edge, a handwritten date, July 16th, 1992. Caroline carried it into the viewing room. The screen flickered to life. The Hatteras dock appeared, but it was clearly 30 years ago. Erik helped Emily into her life jacket. She laughed, waved, perfectly serene, heartbreakingly unaware. Caroline almost looked away. Then the camera shifted. It panned toward the trees at the edge of the dock. And there he was. Not Rhodes, not Tenko. A different man, standing in shadow. Wide-brimmed hat, gloved hands, leaning on a cane with a silver wolf's head carved into it. His eyes, sharp, calm, looked straight into the camera, as if he knew someone would one day see. Then he stepped backward into the brush and disappeared. Caroline froze the frame, printed it, pinned it at the center of her board. For the first time, the case file changed names. No longer Rhodes, no longer Tenko. Now it read, Unknown Operator, alias the Overseer, status, at large. Below that, she wrote, Emily was the first to escape. She won't be the last. A week later, the FBI raided an isolated property in Pennsylvania, the house Emily had circled on her map. Inside they found 3 children, thin, terrified, but alive. A boy of 19 and 2 younger girls. When shown a photo of Emily, they nodded faintly. She said she'd come back. In the basement, they found over 200 VHS tapes, neatly stacked, labeled in sequence, but all copies. The originals were nowhere to be found. The FBI called the remaining members of the network, the ones who stay. But Caroline knew that was only part of it. The one truly pulling the strings, the Overseer, was still out there. On the final night, Caroline stood alone on the Hatteras dock. Waves lapped below, the cold sea air sharp and salty on her face. The town behind her slept, unaware. But somewhere out there, his shadow lingered. Then she heard it. Bells, faint, distant, carried on the wind, blending with the surf. Not clear where they came from. Not clear if they were even real. But they echoed like a quiet warning. He was still here. Caroline closed her eyes, drew a slow breath, and let the sound wash over her. The hunt wasn't over yet.